Okay, so ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling something. It's always in the news, always up for debate. But how well do we really get the U.S. political system?
It's kind of like you think you know how something works, right? Until you have to actually, explain it to someone.
Exactly. And we're not talking about acing a civics test here. This is about how power actually works,
Yeah.
how those decisions that impact us every day, how are those made? So we're going deep into excerpts from Politics of the United States, a Wikipedia deep dive, really uncovering the surprising stuff, the crucial stuff they might not have taught us back in school.
Because, beyond the headlines, beyond those snappy sound bites, there's this fascinating and honestly often perplexing system at play.
Yeah, the source, it lays out the basics, right? The U.S., we're a constitutional federal republic. Yeah. Words we've all heard. What do they actually mean, though, for you and me?
Well, it boils down to this. Power, it's divided.
Hmm.
See, the Founding Fathers, after breaking free from, British rule, they were pretty wary of anyone having too much power or centralized authority.
Yeah.
So what they did was they created this system where the federal government has its own lane, right? But then the states, they have their own powers too, even their own constitutions.
So it's almost like they intentionally built in
Yeah.
this tension, this push and pull between the two,
Yeah.
right from the start.
Exactly. It was all about balance, national unity, but also this fear of tyranny. And within both the federal and state levels, you've got those three branches of government:
Yeah.
legislative, executive, judicial, like a political rock, paper, scissors,
Mhm.
keeps any one branch from getting too powerful.
Right. So Congress, they make the laws, the president tries to get stuff done, and the courts, they're the referees. I mean, we learned that back in grade school, but it's got to be way more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Take the presidency, for example. We always hear about winning the popular vote, but that's not the whole story. Then there's this thing called the Electoral College. There's a real wrench in things.
That's true. You could win the most votes across the entire country and still lose. Happened in 2000 with Bush and Gore. Happened again in 2016 with Clinton and Trump. How does that even work?
Okay, so with the Electoral College, when you vote, you're actually voting for a group of people called electors. They're the ones who pledge to support, your candidate. And then they're the ones who actually cast the official votes for president.
So it's not just about getting the most people to vote for you. It's about winning over, what, the right states, the right combination?
Exactly. Each state gets a certain number of these electors based on how many people they have in Congress. It's a reflection of how the Founding Fathers, they were concerned about direct democracy. They wanted to give less populated states a bigger say in who became president.
Makes those swing states even more important come election time. Now, something else our source mentions is that a lot of what impacts us day to day, it actually happens at the state level, even the local level.
That's right. We tend to focus on Washington, D.C., but think about it. What's the legal driving age? What do you need to get married? What's taught in schools? A lot of that is decided by each state. Creates a really fascinating patchwork across the country.
Meaning where you live in the U.S. can really shape your life, your experiences.
Absolutely. And it gets even more, I don't know, hyper-local than that. Because on top of federal and state governments, we're talking counties, cities, townships, and then special districts.
Yeah. This is where it gets interesting. I always wonder, you see those signs for soil and water conservation district?
Yeah.
It sounds like something out of Parks and Rec.
Right. But it highlights this key point. Just how much power is actually spread out in this system. These special purpose governments, there's over 37,000 of them. They handle incredibly specific tasks, managing resources, mosquito control, the list goes on.
Layers upon layers of government. But why so many? Is this more that checks and balances just at every single level?
Yeah.
Or did it just happen this way?
It's a little of both, honestly. That emphasis on decentralized power, that comes from the Founding Fathers. But the sheer number of local governments, that shows how this nation has evolved, constantly adapting to new needs, new challenges.
Speaking of adapting, evolving, right? Let's talk voting. Our source mentions this wild journey from shouting your choice to secret ballots. I mean, secret ballots almost feel sacred now.
Yeah, it really is remarkable how much the process has changed. I mean, can you imagine a time when elections were like public spectacles, people literally yelling out their votes?
I can't even imagine the peer pressure. So how do we go from shouting matches to those little booths, those curtains?
It was a gradual thing, a gradual evolution. Public voting eventually gave way to written ballots. But even those, at first, those were public. And get this, they were often printed by, are you ready for this, the political parties themselves.
Wait, the parties were in charge of making the ballots.
Right.
Talk about a recipe for disaster. Or at least, some very biased ballot design.
Oh, for sure. It was a system just made for manipulation. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the U.S. finally adopted the Australian secret ballot. That's what standardized things, finally gave us that crucial privacy.
Wow. It's amazing, something we totally take for granted today.
Hmm.
This right to a secret ballot, it had such a crazy history.
Yeah.
But okay, let's switch gears a little bit to a topic that, it's always a hot one, the two-party system. In a country with so much diversity, so many different viewpoints, why does it always seem to come down to Democrats and Republicans?
It's a question a lot of people ask, a lot of people are baffled by, and the answer, it's complicated. It goes way back. It's about history, tradition, even how our elections work, mechanics of the whole thing.
Yeah, our source, it points to this first past the post voting system as like a major factor. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that whoever gets the most votes in a district, that's it, they win, even if they don't get a majority. And this really hurts third parties because they almost never have enough support to actually win.
So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? People, they hesitate to vote for these smaller parties because they don't think those parties are going to win. And then because of that, those parties, they never really even get a chance.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got the issue of campaign finance. Running for office, especially at the national level, you need a ton of money, an insane amount of money. And that's something the two major parties, they've got a huge advantage.
It's like a huge barrier to entry for anyone else who wants to play the game. Like trying to run a marathon when two runners, they got a head start and an endless supply of energy drinks.
That's a great analogy. It is. But it's also important to remember the two main parties, they haven't always been as, I don't know, as ideologically rigid as they are now. Both the Democrats and the Republicans, they've gone through some major transformations.
So you're saying there was a time when their platforms were more, I don't know, more fluid, more open to changing, to evolving.
Totally. Take the Democrats, for example. They were once the party of the Solid South. But then you get to the civil rights movement in the 60s. Their stance on that, it caused a huge upheaval, a huge shift. A lot of voters, they realigned.
It just reminds you that these parties, they aren't static. They're constantly grappling with these internal conflicts, adapting to whatever's happening in society.
And those adaptations, those internal struggles, they often reflect what's happening in America as a whole. It's like studying these parties, it's like a window into our nation's history.
It's kind of wild to think about how much these parties have, changed over time. But with all this talk about the system itself, the parties, the voting, it makes you wonder, is it actually working? Our source, it doesn't shy away from, some serious criticisms of the U.S. political system.
Rightfully so. I mean, no system is perfect,
Yeah.
right? And the U.S. model, it's got these lofty ideals, but it's got its flaws, for sure. One of the big ones, one of the most glaring, it's this whole issue of underrepresentation.
So you're saying the makeup of our government, it doesn't really match up with who actually lives in the U.S.?
Yes, exactly. Like women, for example. They're more than half the population, but they're still way underrepresented in Congress. Same goes for a lot of racial and ethnic minority groups. So it makes you think, whose voices are actually being heard and whose are being ignored.
That's such an important point. It's like we're having this town hall meeting, but only certain people were allowed to speak. Something else our source brings up is this whole influence of, wealth, special interest groups. Is the U.S., are we drifting towards this oligarchy where it's just the ultra-rich, the powerful calling all the shots?
It's a big concern. It's something a lot of political scientists, activists, they've been talking about. The amount of money in politics, it's crazy, especially from corporations, these really wealthy donors. And it's skyrocketed. So yeah, it raises some serious questions like whose interests are really being served when policies are being made.
It's that old saying, right? He who has the gold makes the rules. And then, on top of all this, you've got the issue of polarization. It feels like the U.S. is being pulled in two completely different directions. Like, there's less and less common ground.
Yeah, polarization, it's complicated, but our source, it points to this really concerning trend, this growing movement within one party, the Republicans, to just refuse to accept defeat in an election.
So we're talking about, like, potentially undermining the very foundation of democracy, right?
Yeah.
This peaceful transfer of power based on the results of an election.
Yeah, and we've seen this play out, attempts to overturn the 2020 election results, this distrust in elections themselves. It's dangerous. It erodes the public's faith in the whole democratic process.
Okay, so that's, the pretty bleak picture of U.S. politics.
Mhm.
So where to go from here? Any hope for reform? Or are we just stuck with this system that honestly seems kind of broken?
That is the million-dollar question, right? The good news is People are thinking about this. People are coming up with potential solutions. Our source, it mentions some interesting ideas. Things like term limits for Congress, even new ways to elect Supreme Court justices.
It's interesting to think about how that would even work, how those types of reforms would, actually change things.
For sure. And look, there's no easy fix, no magic solution to these huge challenges. But just talking about them, critically examining the system, imagining ways to make it better, that's a good first step, right?
Absolutely. Understanding the system, that's got to be the first step towards fixing it.
Exactly. And hey, who knows? Maybe this deep dive will get our listeners thinking, what changes would you make to create a political system that actually represents us? That actually works. That's something to think about as we all try to navigate this, crazy, complicated, constantly changing world of US politics.